and have a seat when that's done. Today, as you guys know, we're going to be talking about President Obama's influence and impact while he's been in term for 8 years. And we're going to get these four professors, Johnsen, Jeanine Bell, Kevin Brown, and Steve Sanders. We're going to get their opinions about how they feel that Obama has impacted the United States in different ways, whether it be economically or politically. So I think they have decided who's going to start. You guys have an order?
I think you said
You're last.
Okay, you're first.
You're first. I'm second.
okay.
I'm third.
Okay.
Right, all right. Well, you have about 6 to 8 minutes, I believe.
All right. Great. So I am going to try to fill in things that I know my colleagues are not going to talk about. And so I narrowed it down to 5 things that have to be said that I don't believe otherwise would be. So I'm going to talk fast, but first I'm going to tell a little story because my husband happened to be meeting with President Obama a few weeks ago with a bunch of mayors. My husband's a mayor here. And someone asked President Obama at that meeting, what do you want your legacy to be and what do you think your legacy will be? So he told me this morning. He said, you have to tell him this. And his answer was, I have no idea. I'm not thinking about legacy. But how I hope I will be remembered. And this was in a kind of a private meeting, not on the record. So I don't think it's been recorded. They said, how I hope I will be remembered is the same aspiration I have for my girls and what I tell them. I hope people will say that he was kind to all people and that he was useful, that he accomplished something useful with what he had to work with. And then he said he also adds to his girls, try not to be too lazy. So that's what he said. So I think his legacy, he's going to be remembered as a great president. And the 5 things I'm going to focus on quickly, I think you really need to remember what he started with. What a mess he inherited from President Bush. And I worked on his transition team. And I remember in great detail, like all the late night jokes, like who would want to be president at this time, and what a disaster the country was. 2 wars, we were in the midst of a great recession, in part because of those wars. Financial crisis, housing crisis, the auto industry was failing. So I don't know if you remember how bad it was. Also an extraordinarily hostile Congress in which the Senate, the later Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said our #1 goal is to ensure President Obama is a 1-term president and to do anything necessary to make that happen. So that, in light of that, here are my big 5. He saved the economy. He fought hard in Congress and got the stimulus package, banking reform. So unemployment was 10% in 2009. Now it's 4.9%. Also, remember when Republicans threatened to destroy the global economy by not raising the debt ceiling? We know that was an international financial crisis that his administration averted. #2, Affordable Care Act, 15 million fewer people who lack health care and still building. 3, important steps to address climate change. 4, foreign relations, especially the Iran nuclear deal, just generally how he's dealt internationally in foreign affairs. And then 5, I'm going to focus a little more on what I think is less appreciated, but so fundamentally important, especially to those of us who care about the rule of law. He restored respect in the executive branch for the rule of law. And again, that is especially apparent when measured against George W. Bush and Dick Cheney's approach to presidential power and law. So, as I mentioned, he came into office with 2 wars going on, and remember the general war on terror, which he does not talk about in those terms anymore. So President Bush and Cheney, they wanted to create a legacy. I mean, they have said expressly their desire was to go it alone, to establish inherent constitutional authority to fight wars without congressional declarations or authorizations, and to act contrary to federal statutes. So remember torture? Remember President President Obama, came in and radically changed the country's torture and interrogation policy, because we're going to follow federal statutes, which is not really a revolutionary idea. Most presidents have and do, but President Bush, and especially Dick Cheney was very active on this front, wanted to create precedent for expansive presidential power to act contrary to congressional statutes. So we had a federal law prohibiting torture, and President Bush's Office of Legal Counsel said presidents don't have to follow that. That war powers, national security powers, give the president the power to violate those federal statutes and to do it in secret. To torture people in secret. Another big area was surveillance, even domestic surveillance, in secret. So Congress doesn't even know that the president is acting contrary to congressional statute. So that I want to add as my fifth, and I think least appreciated accomplishment, and what I think will be hopefully a lasting legacy, respect for the rule of law, and not relying on secret law. And I actually testified twice before the Senate during the Bush administration against this notion of the president being able to secretly violate federal statutes and base it on some notion of sweeping inherent power. And last thing, the president, you'll remember, President Bush, you'll remember also, not just on torture and surveillance, in hundreds and hundreds of signing statements. He would sign a bill into law and then have this vague language reserving the right not to adhere to certain provisions that he thought unduly restrained presidential power. So that is a dramatic change. And my last example, Guantanamo. So Guantanamo might look like a failure, and I actually helped draft the executive order where President Obama said, I'm going to close it in a year. So that might look like a failure. To put a good spin on it, actually, it's a success of the rule of law. What happened is Congress came in and said President Obama may not transfer people from Guantanamo to the U.S., and President Obama, as much as he hates that and as awful policy that it is, has adhered to that federal statute and complied and worked hard. He's working hard to close Guantanamo, but Congress has erected that obstacle, and under the Bush-Cheney approach, maybe, President Bush would have said, my inherent power as Commander-in-Chief allows me to close it despite the federal statute. And I'd say its greatest failure related to all this is we still do not have enough transparency. We still have too much, I think, secrecy with regard to national security, things like targeted killing with drones, but I will leave it there.
All right. I will begin. I'm speaking about Obama's legacy in the area of criminal justice, and I will begin by, as Professor Johnsen did, citing the difficulty that President Obama faced coming in. It was a hard time in 2009 to be the leader of the free world with respect to criminal justice. The U.S., for anyone, the U.S. incarcerates a larger percentage of its citizens than any democracy. So this begins. It is especially hard if you're an African American, because African Americans and Latinos make up 30% of our population, just over 30%, and they make up nearly 60% of our prison inmates. African Americans specifically, and there is tons of data on this, are much more likely to be stopped and more likely to be arrested. Oddly enough, I want to throw in, when you do searches of the individuals that you are stopping that are African American, they are less likely to have contraband on them than are whites who are searched, and there's data all over the country about this. These drastic disparities between blacks and whites in the criminal justice system rarely get mentioned by white presidents. This is not so with Obama, who has said several of the statements that I've just made about disparity at numerous times over the course of his presidency. Obama began by speaking truth to power about policing. It is very hard for politicians to speak about, say anything that is negative about police officers. Police officers have very powerful lobbies, and in recent years they have started to behave in ways that are not so nice in response to the slightest negative comments about law enforcement action. So, for instance, in 2009, right, this is Obama's the beginning of his first term. Cambridge police officers arrest the most famous black professor in the country on his own front landing. President Obama says that the police in Cambridge had acted stupidly in arresting this particular professor, who we knew, right? This was a little more candor than we had come to expect about police behavior. And he ended up meeting with the officer and Professor Gates at the White House in the beer summit. So that was just the beginning. There were many, many substantive issues in the wake of the beer summit. For instance, in 2010, Obama signed a bill that reduced the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity, or the 100-to-1 sentencing ratio between crack and powder cocaine from 101 to 18-to-1. He said that he was going to eliminate it, but 18-to-1. In 2012, the bad news on the criminal justice front continued. In 2012, February 2012, Trayvon Martin is shot. And President Obama, again, weighs in on the killing, calling it a tragedy, urging cooperation between law enforcement, and he personalizes this. He personalizes by saying, listen, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. So he moves the tragedy to the personal and suggests that this is an important issue. And after the next year, in the wake of the jury decision, Obama weighs in again. And he cites the issue of profiling. In the last year, I'm going to fast forward to the last or so years of his term and mention a couple of issues. So in the wake of Ferguson happens in 2014, the next year, right? And he responds to Ferguson and the protests surrounding the killing of Michael Brown by creating a task force on 21st century policing. There's a coalition of community leaders, law enforcement, developing solutions. In 2015, he ends the practice of solitary confinement of juveniles in federal prisons. This is an issue that affects roughly 10,000 individuals. In ending this, he calls for, or he mentions the death of a young black man who committed suicide after he'd been in solitary confinement for a couple of years. And he says, listen, we have to stop this for juveniles. In the last year, Obama has spoken up on the issue of racial profiling, mentioning his own experiences with racial profiling, and he says, listen, this is a problem. He looks at the data and says, and I'm going to end with a quote from Obama. He says, the data on racial profiling suggests that this is not an aberration. All right, these are strong words about racial profiling. And I think the biggest contribution has been that Obama has said what many African Americans are experiencing and has personalized it. So I'll stop there.
Great. So I'm going to talk about President Obama's effect on the judiciary, on judges, on the Supreme Court. Obviously, Article 2 gives the president the power to appoint judges, and we've long thought that that's one of the most important powers that a president has, especially in terms of the power of that president to shape the country and the justice system and the law for years, sometimes decades after they actually leave office. At this law school, we have active chapters of both Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society. And those two organizations are primarily devoted, most of the programming they end up doing, most of the speakers they bring are talking in one way or another about the courts, about the Supreme Court, or about doctrine that the lower courts are developing or following or not following. So, we sort of begin from the idea that if you think about these issues and you're trained in law school, you have some sort of a vision of what justice should be. You have a vision of what the courts should look like, the work that they should do, and the values that they should bring to their work. This idea that judges do nothing other than call balls and strikes like umpires only applies to the district courts. So at the lowest level, at a trial court, we expect that a judge is going to just take established law and apply it to the facts in front of her or him. But that is not much. Many times federal courts of appeals are not doing that work. They're actually having to fill in gaps and decide what the law should be in a situation where Congress has been vague or hasn't spoken. And by definition, nothing gets to the Supreme Court if its resolution is actually clear. The Supreme Court almost inherently makes law, whether it's constitutional law or filling in gaps in statutory law. So this is an important power. And as I said, if you're actively thinking about this, you have a particular vision of what judges and courts should look like and be like. So what is President Obama's record on that front? And I want to touch on three things. One, the diversity and the demographics of his judicial appointees. Second, his own apparent judicial philosophy, what values he thinks his judicial appointees should have. And then third, the success that he's had in the face of obstruction. So President Obama gets an A+ for diversity, for the diversity of his appointments. 42 of President Obama's judicial appointments, 42% have been women, in comparison to 22% for President Bush and 29% for President Clinton. He has appointed more female judges than any other president, including more female Court of Appeals judges, Federal Circuit judges. African Americans, confirmed African American judges, 19% for President Obama versus 16% for President Clinton, 7% for Bush. He has appointed as many African American circuit judges, 9, as any president in history. And he's already appointed more African American women to the federal bench than any other president in history. Hispanics, 11% of President Obama's appointees have been Hispanic, 9% for Bush, 7% for Clinton. Asian Americans, 7% for President Obama, 1% each for Bush and for Clinton. President Obama has appointed the first Native American female federal judge. And something that's particularly striking to me, 11 of President Obama's confirmed judges have been openly gay or lesbian. That compares to only one prior to 2009, someone who had been appointed by President Clinton but wasn't confirmed until later. So the number of openly gay or lesbian federal judges has also been impressive. 88% of President Obama's judges have worked outside of private law firms. 90% have worked in the public service. 64% have served on the board of legal services or other public interest organizations. What do we know about President Obama's judicial philosophy? Most of you know that Obama is a lawyer. He was editor of the Harvard Law Review, and he taught constitutional law, specifically 14th Amendment, for many years at the University of Chicago. So presumably this is a man who has thought about the Constitution and has thought about the values that should underlie our judicial system. This is probably an area where, it's safe to say President Obama has disappointed some of his otherwise progressive allies on many other issues, that he has not particularly articulated a vision for what he thinks judges should do. I'll read you just a paragraph from a story assessing Obama's judicial appointments by Jeffrey Toobin a few months back in the New Yorker. Toobin says, beyond diversity, the story of Obama's influence on the courts is more complex. Indeed, it could serve as a metaphor for his presidency, symbolically rich but substantively hazy. Obama took office after years of intense conservative focus on the courts. Going back to the Reagan administration, conservative activists and conservative organizations have seen judicial appointments, and particularly the types of judges who are appointed, as critical to carrying out their vision of government. Progressives arguably less so, or at least less successfully. George Bush spoke often of the need for judges who, quote, will strictly apply the Constitution and laws, not legislate from the bench. The conservative agenda, including limiting abortion rights, ending racial preferences, and lowering barriers between church and state. Obama has shrunk from an ideological battle with conservatives on these constitutional issues. Claims for his judges are grounded in their personal integrity and professional competence. Notwithstanding their qualifications, many of his appointees have drawn fierce opposition from Senate Republicans. In those battles, too, where his judicial legacy has been at stake, the president has chosen to remain largely above the fray. Now, you may think that a president shouldn't have litmus tests or particular expectations for what kinds of policies his or her judicial appointments will carry out, that violates the very idea of a separation of powers or judicial integrity. You can, argue whichever way you want. The point is that this is an area that, at least for some progressives, President Obama has been a disappointment. He has frequently not articulated a specific constitutional vision on some of the most important questions that recur in the criminal justice system or in constitutional law that come to the courts. Just final point briefly, what has been his success in filling vacancies? So there are a total of 870 federal judges, district judges, Court of Appeals judges, Supreme Court judges. I don't have the figure. I believe President Obama at this point has appointed a majority of the current sitting judges. You get a fair number of judicial appointments over the course of 8 years. Still, there are 73 current vacancies, one well-known, one on the Supreme Court, 9 in the circuit courts, 61 in the district courts. In 31 situations has what's called a judicial emergency been declared, essentially meaning that courts are saying we don't have enough people to do the work that's necessary in this district. There are 35 pending Obama nominees in Congress, in the Senate, who have not gotten any action or any hearing. 7 for district court appointees. I'm not sure how this math adds up, but 7 for district courts. Circuit courts, and 27 for district courts, and an additional 12 awaiting floor votes. Whether you think the Republicans have been more obstructionist toward Obama than the Democrats were toward George Bush sort of depends on how you count, whether you talk about filibusters as opposed to just not bringing somebody to the floor. But I think it is an accurate sense that also things have slowed, that witnessed the Supreme Court, the Senate's refusal to consider any Obama nominee for the Supreme Court, which is unprecedented and outrageous, I think. We've also seen a lot of inaction on his judicial nominees. And last year, I think something only like 11 circuit court judges, nominees were actually appointed, and that was the lowest level in history. So we still see a lot of obstructionism. President Obama has had an undeniable imprint on federal courts in many ways, yet because of the obstructionism in the Senate by Republicans, I would argue, that imprint still, that legacy is not what it could otherwise be.
I'm going to stand up because I always think better standing up. For me, I think the most significant thing about Obama's presidency was his election. And I'm going to talk about that in international terms and in domestic terms. You know, I used to teach a course on race and law, and it taught that like 25 years. But over the last few years, I've started doing more and more comparative inequality, comparing the struggles of African Americans in the United States with that of other oppressed groups in their country. Untouchables in India, blacks in South Africa, blacks in the United Kingdom, as examples. And in that international work that I've been doing, the election of President Obama has been absolutely huge. Now keep in mind, I deal with the oppressed people, so I'm not saying the power brokers in those other countries care about the African American experience, but the oppressed people in those countries do. And us being able to demonstrate the ability to have an African American president added that to Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, as Secretary of State, add that to the respect that they have for American music, for American sports, has created a tremendously positive image of the African American community and these oppressed communities that I deal with. So in that way, I think he's been absolutely huge, just the election alone, and indeed not once, but twice. Now, domestically, you know, I was in law school in 1982, third year. We were around the table, a group of us as black students, and a brother from South Africa came to us, and he asked the question. He said, 1982, so right, this is Ronald Reagan's presidency. And just a footnote, in my life, that was the worst time, the Reagan presidency. But this brother asked, he said, has America ever had a black president? And there's about a dozen of us as black law students around this table. We all collectively laughed. Because it's kind of cute, this naive question, have we ever had a black president? And we say, yeah, no, of course we've never had a black president. In fact, not only have we never had one, we never will have one. Look, you're in South Africa. One day you'll get majority rule. One day you'll have a black president. It'll never happen here. And if I think about the blacks in my law school, by the time we got to the early 90s, the blacks who went to law school with me at Yale constituted 10% of the black professors teaching law. So this is really kind of the understanding of, I'd say, virtually every black person in the 1980s. And what it means to me is, now you guys have actually lived 8 years with a black president. You know, for someone like me, it was amazing. I never thought it would happen. But that was the base level my generation was coming from. Your base level is so much higher in terms of how little race should impact your lives, and therefore there's a much greater of a sense to combat the kind of issues of racism that my generation would not have combated because we had other issues to combat. And I think about Chris Rock last night when he talked about the Oscars. I mean, in some ways, right, my God, that was the 88th holding of the Oscars. And 71 times, no person of color was nominated. Yet this time, it became an issue. Why is that? Well, different baseline, different focus on different kinds of acts of racism. The Black Lives Matters movement. I grew up just about the same way every black male grew up in my time. You don't mess with the police. When the police stop you, you be as deferential as possible because they will shoot you, they will kill you. This was the message that we received. Police killing black males, I mean, that's gone on in America since police had guns. Yet this time it's an issue. This time people are saying we're going to do something about it. We're going to stop. We're going to change police practices. And I take that back to Obama. Because if you can elect a black president, we can root out other aspects of racism that, frankly, we thought before then were simply things you just had to live with. So I'd say that, to me, is the most important part of the Obama presidency, his election.
So now if you guys have any questions or any of the professors.
I'll begin. Thank you to all of you for all of your thoughts. And while this is largely a panel that supports Obama, filled by a room that largely, I assume, supported Obama, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the other side of the spectrum. You've reflected quite positively in the last 30 minutes, but what criticisms can be said, particularly in this climate where every day we're hearing criticisms from the right and the presidential candidate that are coming in a post-Obama world. But what criticism can be given to legislation such as the Affordable Care Act, its impact on the criminal justice system and the judiciary, and internationally and abroad, just kind of to get the other side of the reflection.
I'll just say income inequality.
Yeah,
Like he saved the economy, saved the global economy, and unemployment is halfway, but income, he has not made progress on, significant progress on reducing income inequality.
I will say with respect to police, criticism of police behavior, the Black Lives Matter movement is about police behavior, right? And Obama has been very careful not to criticize the police too much at all. In fact, if you Google sort of police killing and Obama, you come up with nothing, right? So Obama has largely avoided criticism of the police in shooting cases or police action shooting, however you want to describe them, which is kind of surprising given the shootings that we've seen.
I'd have to go back to, I also used to teach law and education. I haven't done that except once in the last 13 years. But I think there's been tremendous disappointment in terms of education people that we thought he would be quicker at stopping No Child Left Behind. There'd be a renewed effort and interest on school integration. And he hasn't done any of that. Indeed, he's gone the other way. He's supported this pro-choice charter school movement, and I think that would probably be the greatest disappointment.
On the specific issue I talked about, the courts, I would say even if you don't think, that it's fine, a president doesn't necessarily need a vision for changing the law, reshaping the law in the way many Republican presidents have had, that Obama at least hasn't fought hard enough for his nominees, hasn't made more of an issue of the obstructionism. And I think it goes to a larger point that I guess it's a fault in that I thought throughout his presidency Obama has been too nice. I mean, when I think of the indignities that have been heaped on this man, now culminating in this idea that he doesn't get to appoint a Supreme Court justice, and the equanimity that he seems to accept this with, his failure to fight harder early in his presidency, the idea that he thought the Republicans were going to be reasonable with him when they weren't, and he finally sort of seemed to figure that out. I mean, it's not that I'm that partisan a person, it's just that I think he was either naive or fearful of coming across as really strong, as really blunt, and as really saying what needs to be said. A couple of years ago, there was a skit at, it's like the White House Correspondents' Dinner or the Gridiron Dinner. Obama's anger, what was the name of it? His anger translator, Lionel, was it Luther? Luther, my anger translator. I thought that was one of the most telling, one of the most brilliant skits I had ever seen, because there seems, I think there's such a need for that. So I think he has often shrunk from battles he shouldn't have shrunk from, but the flip side of that is he has shown such enormous dignity, I think, in his behavior. Even David Brooks, a Republican columnist for the New York Times, wrote a couple of weeks ago, given what we're seeing in the presidential campaign, he said, I already miss the sort of inherent dignity, generosity, equanimity that Obama has always displayed as president.
Could I just say, I mean, a lot of people say this, but I think someone should say this. Could an African-American man,
Right.
as president, have done anything else?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Right.
You know, I think his success. And would it have made any difference? I think not. You know, like, I think his administration, my nomination was pending that whole first year. I think they were a little naive, and I could not believe that they would jeopardize national security, for example, in some ways they did. But, so I think in the beginning people were a little naive, but pretty quickly learned how obstructionist they would be. But I think he played it right, and I think it is who he is. I think it also is who he is.
And one of the things that that is not seen by all of us is in the background, the gloves are off. I mean, you know, the sort of, it's very nasty, the types of threats coming to the White House, threats on the president's life, sort of family, all sorts of things are, there are lots of them, right? Unprecedented level of threats. So many threats that the Secret Service cannot handle them. And, you know, you don't want to make it even uglier than it is because it's already pretty ugly.
This is kind of a follow-up question to some of those comments. And Professor Saunders, the quotation he read had a phrase that kind of struck me: symbolically rich but substantively hazy. And I was just wondering if the panel feels that's a fair assessment. You know, I think there are a lot of people who supported Obama who are maybe disappointed that, and obviously it's not all his fault, there has been an obstructionist Congress, there are always political realities. But it does seem as if it's hard to point to a specific, you know, milestones that he's achieved. And I was wondering if maybe you could say some of your favorite substantive actions that were able to get done.
I've already said, you know, big things. I think what he did was focus on accomplishing big things, ending wars, saving the economy, health care for all, and foreign relations, nuclear, climate change, you know, restore rule of law. So I think those are all huge, amazing accomplishments. What he didn't do, and here's where I kind of agree with Professor Sanders, is President Clinton was more likely, his administration, to be working on hundreds of little things and getting things done kind of below the radar, which I think President Obama could have done more of that. But they made the very strategic choice to focus on what I think are amazing milestones, especially given the horrible situation he confronted when he took office. And the obstructionism is unlike most presidents have. It's far worse than usual, I would say.
I think with respect to criminal justice, he set the bar really high. You know that before Obama, no sitting president had ever been to a prison? He was the first one to go to a federal prison. And it was the same week where he commuted the sentence of 46 nonviolent offenders, right? He said, all right, you guys, you know, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. That is setting the bar pretty high for the next president. We'll see. I'm not going to hold my breath, though.
And I think I'd probably say he certainly has an obstructionist Congress to deal with, but I don't think he's getting the credit he deserves for the economy. I mean, if you look at where we were headed towards a Great Depression, something that probably would have meant half of the people in this room, including faculty, would be in here had he not averted it. That was a huge thing for I think everyone, and it did. It hand-strapped what else he could get done, but that was huge.
And I'm not sure, Tubin said substantively hazy. That made sense, mean there's no sort of unifying theme, but perhaps the best retrospective I've read so far on Obama was an article in January on Politico. It's called The Nation He Built by Michael Grunwald. It's a long article that really catalogs all kinds of things you probably weren't even aware of in energy and foreign policy, and I mean all sorts of domestic policy areas where Obama has actually been Roosevelt says, has produced much more sweeping change than many of his supporters or detractors realize. He's turned out to be much more of a doer and action-oriented policy grind who has often failed to communicate what he's done. So I think just cataloging important accomplishments of this presidency, even if they're not as big as the Affordable Care Act, will take time and reflection and appreciation.
That's all we have time for. If you guys have more questions, you can always reach out to the professors. We just want to thank you for coming. That was a great discussion.